March 22, 1945, 9:47 p.m. The Rhine River, Oppenheim Sector, Germany. A German sentry on the eastern bank lights a cigarette. The flame from his lighter flickers once. Then a bullet tears through his throat. He drops without a sound, the cigarette still burning in the mud. 40 seconds later, the first American assault boat hits the water. No artillery, no air support, no warning, just silence, oars, and 200 men crossing the most feared river in Nazi Germany's entire defensive strategy. 6 hours later, George S. Patton would pick up the phone and say 7 words that would make Eisenhower drop his pen, send Montgomery into silent fury, and force the German High Command to admit something they had never admitted about any Allied commander in the entire European war. But to understand why those 7 words shattered the entire Allied command structure overnight, you need to understand what the Rhine River actually meant in March of 1945. Because this wasn't just a river. This was the last wall standing between the Third Reich and total collapse. And every German general, every Allied planner, every intelligence officer on both sides agreed on one thing: crossing it would cost thousands of lives. They were wrong. By exactly 2,994 casualties. This is the story of how one general, operating without authorization, without air support, without a single artillery shell fired, crossed Hitler's last great barrier with only 6 wounded soldiers and no men killed. And how that single unauthorized act changed the entire trajectory of the final weeks of World War II. Let's go back to the beginning. By early March 1945, the war in Western Europe had reached a strange and brutal stalemate. The Allied armies had fought their way across France, through the Siegfried Line, and were now standing at the banks of the Rhine. On paper, Germany was finished. Their cities were rubble. Their air force was a ghost. Their fuel reserves were nearly gone. And yet somehow, some way, the Wehrmacht kept fighting, because they had one asset left that no amount of bombing could destroy overnight: the Rhine River itself. 400 miles long, up to 900 feet wide in sections, with currents so powerful they could flip a fully loaded landing craft in under 30 seconds. The Rhine wasn't just a geographic obstacle. It was a psychological fortress. German propaganda called it impassable. Wehrmacht engineers had destroyed every single bridge between Cologne and Mainz. Defensive positions lined the eastern bank for hundreds of miles. And Adolf Hitler had personally issued the order: the Rhine must hold. Any officer who allowed a crossing without his direct authorization would be shot. The Allies understood the stakes. That's why Supreme Commander Eisenhower had spent 3 weeks preparing what would become known as Operation Plunder. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's massive, methodical, overwhelming assault crossing at Wesel. 28,000 engineers, 2,000 artillery pieces, 30,000 airborne troops, 3,500 tons of supplies moved daily. Churchill himself was flying in to watch. The press was assembled. The world was waiting for the moment when the Allies would smash through Germany's last natural barrier in the largest river assault since D-Day. It was supposed to be the defining moment of the European campaign, the headline that would echo through history. Montgomery had been planning it for 3 weeks. Every German intelligence officer in the theater knew it was coming. And every single reserve division that Germany could scrape together was quietly moving north, toward Wesel, to make sure the crossing cost as many Allied lives as possible. That was the situation on March 22, 1945. That was the plan. That was the consensus. And then there was George Smith Patton, Jr. Patton was not a man built for consensus. He was born in San Gabriel, California, in 1885, into a family that had sent men to war for generations. His grandfather died fighting for the Confederacy. His great-uncle died in the same battle. War was not a career choice for Patton. It was inheritance. By the time he entered West Point, he had already decided he would be the greatest combat commander America had ever produced. Not a good general, the greatest. West Point almost broke that dream. Patton struggled academically in his first year and had to repeat it. He graduated 46th in his class of 103. On paper, nothing remarkable. But what the grades didn't measure was the thing that made Patton genuinely dangerous: his absolute, almost pathological obsession with speed and surprise. While other officers were studying defensive doctrine, Patton was reading about Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Napoleon. While other men planned how to hold ground, Patton was always calculating how fast he could take it. By March 1945, he had already proven that obsession correct, more times than anyone could count. In Sicily, his 7th Army had raced Montgomery's forces across the island in a display of speed that embarrassed British command. In France, after Normandy, his 3rd Army had broken out of the hedgerow country and torn across 600 miles in just weeks. The man moved faster than German intelligence could track, faster than his own supply lines could follow, faster, sometimes, than his own orders allowed. Which is exactly how he found himself standing on the western bank of the Rhine at Oppenheim on the night of March 22nd, looking at something that nobody in Allied command had bothered to notice: a gap. While every German division in the sector had been quietly repositioned north to face Montgomery's expected crossing at Wesel, the stretch of river near Oppenheim had been left almost undefended. A few infantry companies, some scattered artillery, no armor. No serious defensive works, just a river that everyone assumed was defense enough on its own. Patton had been watching this gap develop for 2 days. His intelligence officers had flagged it. His forward commanders had confirmed it. The defenses at Oppenheim were, by any tactical measure, an opportunity that would not survive another 48 hours. Once Montgomery's crossing began, the Germans would realize what had happened. They would redeploy. The gap would close. And then there was the other problem. The problem Patton couldn't say out loud but thought about constantly. Eisenhower had given Montgomery priority for everything: fuel, bridging equipment, air support, transport. The entire Allied logistics machine was pointed at Wesel. Patton's 3rd Army was supposed to sit, wait, and serve as a supporting force while Montgomery took the glory, took the headlines, and took the Rhine crossing that everyone agreed would end the war. Patton had one night, maybe less. He didn't call Eisenhower. He didn't call Bradley. He didn't file a request, write a memo, or send a preliminary report. He walked to his forward command post, looked at his division commanders, and said words that none of them would ever forget. "Get me the 5th Infantry across that river tonight. No artillery. No air support. Assault boats only. Move quiet. Move fast. And don't call anyone until we're established on the other side." His commanders looked at each other. Then they looked at the river. Then they looked back at Patton. One of them asked the obvious question: "Sir, we don't have authorization for this." Patton looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "We don't need authorization to follow our orders. Our orders say to cross the Rhine when possible. It's possible. We're crossing." At 2200 hours on March 22, 1945, the first elements of the 5th Infantry Division pushed their assault boats into the Rhine at Oppenheim. No lights, no sound beyond the creak of oars and the current. The men had stripped their equipment to minimum weight. No heavy weapons, just rifles, grenades, and the specific terror of crossing a black river in the dark, while an unknown number of Germans waited on the other side. The first boat hit the far bank at 22:14, the second at 22:16. By 22:30, 3 full companies were across and pushing inland before a single German unit even understood what was happening. The sentry with a cigarette had been the only warning the defenders got, and he was already dead. By midnight, the bridgehead was secure. By 0200 hours on March 23rd, engineers were already dragging pontoon bridge sections to the water. By first light, the first American tanks were rolling across the Rhine River. German soil beneath their treads. No artillery barrage. No massive air assault. No 3 weeks of preparation. 6 casualties, all wounded, none killed. When the German 7th Army sent its first report to High Command that morning, the message was so unbelievable that the receiving officer in Berlin reportedly read it 3 times before transmitting it upward. American forces had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim during the night. Bridgehead secured. American armor now crossing. Estimated enemy strength. Multiple regiments and growing. The German response at the highest level was documented in post-war interrogations of senior Wehrmacht officers. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at German High Command, later told Allied interrogators that the Oppenheim crossing produced what he described as genuine shock at the command level. Not because the crossing happened, but because of how it happened. No preparatory bombardment, no massive buildup, no warning indicators that any intelligence service had detected. Jodl's exact words, recorded in Allied interrogation transcripts. "We expected the Americans to come with everything, with maximum force at maximum preparation. That is what Patton never did. He came with nothing and crossed anyway." At 800 on March 23rd, Bradley called Eisenhower, and the pen rolled off the desk. While Eisenhower was processing what had just happened, while Bradley was ordering bridging equipment and fuel convoys east toward Oppenheim, and while Montgomery was reading the signal report in silent fury at his headquarters in Wesel, Patton was already 3 regiments deep into Germany and calling his staff together for the next phase. He stood over a map table in a requisitioned German farmhouse. Outside, the sound of American tanks crossing his pontoon bridge was a continuous metallic thunder. Frankfurt was circled in grease pencil, 60 miles to the east. He looked at his commanders. He said, "The Germans are confused. Their reserves are moving north to fight Montgomery. There is nothing between us and Frankfurt except scared men and empty roads. So here is what we are going to do." He drew a line east from Oppenheim, through Darmstadt, straight to Frankfurt. "We are not stopping. We are not consolidating. We are not waiting for permission." He looked around the room. "We are going to keep moving until we either run out of fuel or find something we can't push through. And I am personally betting we run out of fuel first." In Berlin, the reports kept coming. More American divisions crossing at Oppenheim. More bridgeheads. More armor on German soil. Hitler reportedly asked his adjutants the same question 11 times in one day. Which general is responsible for this crossing? The answer was always the same. Patton. Always Patton. But here's what nobody at High Command, nobody at Supreme Headquarters, and nobody in Montgomery's meticulously prepared operation understood yet. The Rhine crossing wasn't the victory. The Rhine crossing was just the door opening. What Patton was about to drive through that door would cover 300 miles, capture 19,000 prisoners, and reach positions that Allied planners hadn't expected to achieve until May. And it would all begin with the decision Eisenhower made in the next 48 hours. Because Patton was across the Rhine. He had his bridgehead. He had his tanks. He had his open road. Now he needed one thing from Supreme Headquarters. And what Eisenhower decided to do would determine whether this was a footnote in the campaign's history, or the moment everything changed. The answer Patton got back would surprise everyone. March 23, 1945. 24 hours after 6 American soldiers crossed the Rhine in silence and darkness, George Patton had 3 full divisions on German soil and was already pointing at Frankfurt. Eisenhower knew. Bradley knew. Montgomery knew. And the German High Command was scrambling to understand how the most fortified river barrier in Western Europe had been breached without a single shell fired in preparation. But here is what nobody was saying out loud yet. The crossing was done. The bridgehead was real. The question that would define the next 7 days of the entire European campaign wasn't whether Patton had done something extraordinary. It was whether the men sitting in Supreme Headquarters in Reims would give him what he needed to turn a brilliant tactical move into a strategic catastrophe for Nazi Germany, or whether institutional pride, alliance politics, and 3 weeks of sunk cost in Montgomery's operation would strangle the most dangerous opportunity the Allies had seen since Normandy. The answer was not going to come easily, because standing between Patton and the road to Frankfurt was not the Wehrmacht. It was the Allied command structure itself. Eisenhower's chief logistics officer, Major General Robert Crawford, had spent 21 days building the most precisely calibrated supply operation in the history of the European theater. Every fuel convoy, every bridging battalion, every ammunition train, every transport truck in the Allied inventory had been allocated, scheduled, and routed to support one operation: Montgomery's Operation Plunder at Wesel. The math was done. The timetable was locked. And now, George Patton was asking Crawford to tear up 3 weeks of work overnight. Crawford walked into Eisenhower's morning briefing on March 23rd with a face that communicated exactly what he thought about the situation. He set a logistics summary on the table and spoke without looking up from it. "General, I want to be precise about what Third Army is asking for. 2 bridging battalions, 14 fuel convoys, air transport priority for replacement parts, and Bradley wants a corps-level supply allocation shifted from 21st Army Group to the Oppenheim sector." He paused. "If we do that, we delay Plunder's follow-on phase by 48 hours minimum. We reduce Montgomery's post-crossing fuel reserves by 30%. And we tell every Allied government that signed off on this operational plan that we changed priorities overnight because one general decided to freelance." Eisenhower said nothing for several seconds. Then, "What does Third Army need to hold the bridgehead as a supporting operation only?" Crawford looked up. "That's the problem, sir. Patton isn't asking for a supporting operation. He's asking for an exploitation. He wants resources for a 70-mile advance, not a 5-mile perimeter." That word, exploitation. It was the word that split the room. Because exploitation meant committing. It meant choosing Patton's unauthorized sprint over Montgomery's authorized main effort. It meant Eisenhower publicly acknowledging that the general who had violated every protocol in the command structure had been right. And it meant telling Winston Churchill, who was currently on an aircraft flying toward Wesel to watch the historic crossing of the Rhine, that the historic moment had already happened 2 days ago, 50 miles south, without him. The political implications alone were enough to end careers. Crawford made that clear. "Sir, if we redirect resources to Third Army at this scale, the British chiefs will file a formal complaint, Montgomery will go directly to Churchill. Churchill will go directly to Roosevelt. And we will spend the next 2 weeks explaining to 3 governments why we abandoned an agreed operational plan. Eisenhower picked up the intelligence summary that had arrived that morning. Decoded German signals. Intercepts showing the 7th Army commander sending urgent requests to High Command for armored reserves to be repositioned south, away from Wesel, toward Oppenheim. He read it once. Then he read it again. He looked at Crawford. Those reserves moving south. How many divisions? 2 armored, 1 infantry, possibly a 4th by tomorrow. Moving away from Montgomery. Yes, sir. Eisenhower set the paper down. So Patton's crossing is already weakening the defenses Montgomery will face at Wesel. Crawford had no answer for that, because the answer was yes. And yes made the argument for Patton's exploitation almost impossible to refuse. That was the moment Bradley walked in. He had driven through the night from Luxembourg, and he looked like it. He poured himself coffee, sat down, and said without ceremony, "Ike, I've been on the phone with Patton's forward commanders for the last 6 hours. The roads east of Oppenheim are open. German resistance is described as disorganized and retreating. His armor is moving. His infantry is moving. The only thing that is not moving right now is our decision on whether to support him." Crawford started to speak. Bradley raised one hand, not aggressively, just firmly. "Bob, I know the logistics argument. I know the political argument. I know the Montgomery argument. But I need you to look at this map and tell me when we will have another moment where 3 German divisions are out of position, their reserves are redeploying in the wrong direction, and an American army is already 60 miles into their rear with open road ahead of it." Silence. Bradley finished. "Because if the answer is never, then we should probably get Patton his fuel." Eisenhower stood up, walked to the map, stood there for what his chief of staff later described as the longest 45 seconds of the entire conference. Then he turned around. "Get me Bradley's logistics chief. Tell Crawford to find me 2 bridging battalions and enough fuel for a 72-hour exploitation phase. Don't touch Montgomery's pre-crossing allocations, but everything scheduled for his follow-on phase gets reviewed." He paused. "And get me Patton on the phone. I need to tell him personally that he has support, and that if he takes one single action beyond what we discuss on this call without informing me first, I will relieve him. Is that clear?" Crawford nodded. Bradley said nothing, but when he walked out to find a phone, the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had just won an argument. It was the expression of a man who had just watched history decide something for him. The call to Patton lasted 11 minutes. Eisenhower gave him fuel, gave him bridging support, gave him air priority when available, and made clear that Montgomery still held the official main effort designation. Patton would not appear in press releases as the primary Rhine crossing. Third Army's advance was officially a supporting operation, drawing German reserves south. That was the story. That was the line every press officer would hold. Patton agreed immediately. He agreed because he understood that Eisenhower had just handed him everything he actually needed, and wrapped it in language that kept the alliance intact. He was not interested in press releases. He was interested in Frankfurt. Within 4 hours of that call, the first fuel convoy was moving east toward Oppenheim. By afternoon of March 23rd, 2 pontoon bridges were operational across the Rhine. By evening, the first Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division were rolling off the eastern end of the bridge and turning toward Darmstadt. And then something happened that nobody in Allied command had planned for. Not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not Crawford with all his logistics tables. The Germans broke. Not gradually, not in an orderly fighting withdrawal. They broke the way structures break when the foundation is removed without warning. Entire companies surrendering to single platoons. artillery batteries abandoned with shells still in the breach, regimental commanders burning their own headquarters documents before American forward scouts had gotten within 10 miles. Patton's division commanders started sending reports back to his headquarters that read less like combat updates and more like disbelief transmitted through field radio. Minimal contact. Enemy withdrawing northeast. Road clear for 20 miles. Requesting permission to advance. Then, road clear for 30 miles. Then, we have reached Darmstadt outskirts. German garrison appears to be evacuating. Population waving from windows. In 4 days, the 5th Infantry and the 4th Armored had covered 40 miles. Prisoner counts climbed past 3,000, then 5,000, then 8,000. Each morning briefing brought numbers that exceeded the previous day's projections. German resistance wasn't stiffening, it was dissolving. By March 26th, Patton had 7 divisions across the Rhine. Total casualties for the entire operation since the initial crossing: fewer than 200 men, mostly light wounds. For context, Allied planners had projected that a forced Rhine crossing against prepared defenses would cost between 800 and 1,200 casualties per division in the initial assault phase alone. Patton had crossed with an entire army group and lost fewer men than a single company was expected to lose in the first hour of a conventional assault. In Berlin, the damage reports reaching Hitler's Situation Room were causing what Speer's post-war memoirs described as near paralysis in the planning staff. Field Marshal Kesselring, now commanding in the West, sent a message to High Command on March 26th that was intercepted by Allied signals intelligence and delivered to Eisenhower's desk within hours. The message stated that the American forces crossing at Oppenheim had created a situation that conventional defensive doctrine could not address. The speed of the advance was exceeding the German army's ability to establish new defensive lines before those lines were outflanked. Kesselring requested permission to conduct a general withdrawal east of the Rhine River. Hitler denied the request. Patton kept moving anyway. On March 28th, advance elements of the 4th Armored reached the outskirts of Frankfurt. The city had a garrison. It had defensive preparations. What it did not have was time. Because Patton's armor arrived 2 days before German command had projected it was possible for American forces to be that far east. The math of defensive preparation requires knowing when the enemy is coming. Against Patton, that math never worked. Frankfurt's outer defenses fell on March 28th. The city garrison fought house to house for 1 day. By March 29th, Frankfurt was in American hands. 19,000 prisoners. Bridges across the main river secured intact. Supply lines stretching 70 miles back to Oppenheim. 7 days. 6 wounded in the initial crossing. An entire German army thrown into irreversible retreat. When Eisenhower received the Frankfurt confirmation, he was sitting in the same office where he had dropped his pen 7 days earlier. His chief of staff brought him the report. He read it, set it down, looked at the map on the wall where Oppenheim was marked, where the line of Third Army's advance stretched east like a blade driven into the center of Germany. He said one thing: "Get me a status on Montgomery's consolidation timeline." Because Frankfurt was taken. The Rhine was behind Patton. 7 German divisions were in full retreat, and Montgomery was still building his supply lines at Wesel. But what was coming next was something even Patton hadn't predicted. Because 300 miles to the east, in a complex of buildings outside a small German town, American forward scouts were about to stumble onto something that had nothing to do with military objectives, operational plans, or the race to end the war fastest. Something that would change what the entire campaign meant. something that would redefine what they were actually fighting for. And when Patton saw it, the general who never stopped for anything stopped cold. March 29, 1945. Frankfurt had fallen. 7 divisions across the Rhine. 19,000 prisoners taken. Fewer than 200 total casualties since the first assault boat hit the water at Oppenheim 7 days earlier. Patton had turned an unauthorized river crossing into the fastest deep advance of the entire European campaign. Eisenhower had given him fuel. Bradley had given him bridging equipment. And the road east was open. But 300 miles into Germany, something was waiting that no operational plan had accounted for. Something that would stop George Patton cold. Not German armor. Not a defensive line. Not orders from Supreme Headquarters. Something far worse. In Berlin, the situation reports arriving at Wehrmacht High Command throughout the final week of March read like a clinical documentation of institutional collapse. The 7th Army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Kesselring's requests for withdrawal authorization kept arriving and kept being denied. And Patton's name appeared in the damage assessments with a frequency that senior German officers later described as obsessive. Every briefing, every intercept, every prisoner interrogation that came back through German intelligence channels contained the same answer to the same question. Who is advancing? Patton. How fast? Faster than projected. What are their supply lines? Extended but moving. Can we establish a defensive line before they arrive? No. That last answer was the one that mattered, because German defensive doctrine in 1945 was built on a simple assumption. The attacker moves fast, then stops to consolidate, and in that pause, the defender repositions and builds new lines. It had worked against every Allied advance since Normandy. The pause always came. Logistics forced it. Command caution enforced it. The institutional momentum of large armies grinding forward and then stopping to breathe gave the Germans just enough time to place another obstacle, dig another trench, delay another week. Against Patton, the pause never came. His 4th Armored was already past Frankfurt before German engineers had finished surveying the next defensive position east of the main river. Kesselring sent a message to High Command on April 1st that Allied signals intelligence intercepted within hours. American armored forces in the central sector are advancing at rates that conventional defensive response cannot address. Estimated time before contact with next prepared position, insufficient. He requested strategic withdrawal authority for the entire Army Group G. Hitler denied it again. But the Germans were not simply collapsing. They were adapting. And the adaptation they chose was the one that Patton's forward commanders had been quietly dreading since Frankfurt fell. They stopped trying to hold territory and started targeting supply lines. Patton's 70-mile logistical chain from Oppenheim to Frankfurt and beyond was the operational vulnerability that every skeptic at Supreme Headquarters had raised when Bradley first asked for exploitation resources. A single armored column driving deep into enemy territory can advance faster than the enemy can respond. But it cannot fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. And the Wehrmacht still had enough coherent infantry units in the German interior to begin systematic raids on American supply convoys moving east from the Rhine. The first serious attack came on April 3rd. A convoy of 14 fuel trucks moving east on the Frankfurt-Fulda road was ambushed by a German infantry company operating behind American lines. 6 drivers killed, 11 trucks destroyed. 40,000 gallons of fuel that Patton's armor needed to keep moving went up in smoke on a German road at 0300 hours. It was not a catastrophic loss in absolute terms. But it was a warning. And the warnings multiplied. April 4th, another convoy hit near Hanau. April 5th, a bridge repair unit ambushed outside Darmstadt. The German units conducting these attacks were not armored formations. They were remnants, stragglers, companies separated from their parent divisions during the collapse, now operating as irregular raiders in the gap between American front lines and the Rhine. They couldn't stop Patton's advance, but they could bleed his supply chain. And a supply chain that bleeds long enough eventually stops feeding the army at its end. Patton knew the problem before his logistics staff briefed him on it. He had lived this arithmetic before, in France, when his Third Army outran its fuel supply after the Normandy breakout and halted for 10 days waiting for gasoline, while German forces reconstituted. That halt had cost him 3 months of momentum. He was not going to let it happen again in the final weeks of the European war. His solution was characteristically direct. He pulled 2 infantry regiments from his follow-on forces, assigned them exclusively to convoy escort duty, and ordered his forward commanders to stop waiting for supply columns and start finding German fuel. The order was simple. Every German military vehicle captured with fuel in its tank gets drained, and the fuel goes to American armor. Every German fuel depot overrun gets inventoried before it gets destroyed. We are not stopping because our convoys are getting hit. We are accelerating until we overrun the people hitting them. It worked. Imperfectly. Expensively. But it worked. Then, on April 4th, 1945, Patton's forward scouts reached a small German town called Ohrdruf. What they found there had nothing to do with the war they had been fighting. April 4th, 1945. Ohrdruf, Thuringia, Germany. 0900 hours. Elements of the 4th Armored Division's advance screen were moving through the outskirts of the town when they encountered what they initially reported as a labor camp. The gates were open. The German guards were gone. They had left 24 hours earlier when the sound of American armor became audible from the west. The soldiers who entered first were combat veterans. They had been fighting across Europe for 9 months. They had seen men killed in every way that men can be killed. They had walked through bombed cities and burned villages and fields covered with the dead. None of them had seen anything like Ohrdruf. Thousands of prisoners, skeletal, barely alive. Hundreds of bodies, stacked, shot, left where they fell when the guards evacuated. A gallows in the center of the camp. Evidence of systematic killing conducted not in the heat of battle, but as routine administrative function. The soldiers who entered that camp, and the officers who followed them behind, spent the first hour unable to speak coherently into their field radios. The reports that came back to Patton's headquarters were fragmented, incomplete, not because the soldiers lacked words, but because the words that existed were insufficient for what they were looking at. Patton drove to Ohrdruf himself on April 12th, alongside Eisenhower and Bradley. He was a man who had ordered men to their deaths without hesitation, who had slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a hospital tent and called it weakness, who had driven armies harder than any commander in the theater and accepted the casualties that speed and aggression always cost. He walked through Ohrdruf for 40 minutes. Then he walked to a corner of the camp perimeter, away from his staff, and vomited. He came back, stood in the center of the camp, and said something to Eisenhower that his chief of staff later recorded in his personal diary. "Ike, I want every soldier in Third Army who is not on the front line to see this. Every single one. I want them to see what they are fighting against, not what they are fighting for. What they are fighting against." Eisenhower agreed. He ordered every available American soldier in the area to tour the camp. He sent messages to Washington and London requesting journalists and official witnesses be brought immediately. He was already calculating what the world needed to understand, and what would happen if the world did not see this with its own eyes. For Patton, the calculation was different, simpler, more immediate. He drove back to his forward headquarters and called his division commanders. The call lasted 4 minutes. He told them that the advance east was not changing. The pace was not changing. The objective of ending this war as fast as possible was not changing. But the reason for that objective had just become entirely clear to him in a way that 3 years of combat had never quite clarified. "We are not racing Montgomery," he said. "We are not proving a point to Eisenhower. We are not chasing glory. We are driving east as fast as this army can move, because every day this war continues, there are more ordrifts. And I will not slow down. Not for logistics, not for protocol, not for anyone." Third Army kept moving. By April 15th, Patton's forces had advanced 220 miles from the Rhine. They had liberated dozens of camps. They had captured more than 100,000 prisoners. They had destroyed the remnants of 3 German field armies. The war in Europe had 5 weeks remaining. But the story of what George Patton did with those 5 weeks, the decisions he made, the orders he followed, and the ones he didn't, and the moment when the most aggressive commander in the Allied army found himself stopped by something that wasn't a river or a defensive line or a shortage of fuel. That story has a final chapter. And it is the one that history remembers least and deserves to remember most. From an unauthorized river crossing with 6 casualties to 7 divisions across the Rhine, from a single pontoon bridge at Oppenheim to 220 miles of liberated German territory, from a phone call that made Eisenhower drop his pen to the liberation of Ohrdruf and the brutal clarity of what this war had always been about. Patton had moved faster, hit harder, and cost fewer lives than anyone in Allied command had thought possible in March of 1945. But the question that nobody asked during the advance was the one that mattered most once the shooting stopped. What happens to a man built entirely for war when the war ends? What becomes of the sword when there is nothing left to cut? Because George Patton's story did not end with Frankfurt. It did not end with the Rhine. It ended 8 months after Germany surrendered, on a road outside Mannheim, in a collision so mundane that it seemed almost designed as a final insult to the most dramatic military career America had ever produced. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria. It was exactly the wrong job for exactly the wrong man. Governing required patience. It required diplomacy. It required the willingness to sit in a room and listen to political considerations before acting. Patton had spent 3 years deliberately eliminating all 3 of those qualities from his professional behavior, because in combat, they got people killed. Now, they were the entire job description. He lasted 4 months. In October 1945, he made remarks to the press comparing Nazi Party membership to political affiliation in America, suggesting that former Nazis could be used in the reconstruction of German civil administration. The remarks were not a slip. They reflected a genuine frustration with denazification policy that Patton had been expressing privately for weeks. Eisenhower relieved him of the Bavaria command immediately. It was the only time in their relationship that the relief was not a threat, but a fact. Patton accepted it. He asked to be reassigned to the Pacific, where the war against Japan was still ongoing. The request was denied. Japan surrendered in August. There was no Pacific command to send him to. There was, in the end, no war left anywhere that needed George Patton. He was given command of the 15th Army, a paper headquarters tasked with writing the official history of the European campaign. For a man who had crossed the Rhine in assault boats at night rather than wait 3 weeks for permission, writing military history was its own kind of quiet humiliation. He did it anyway. He was professional. He was thorough. His colleagues said he seemed genuinely diminished in a way that combat fatigue had never managed to produce. On December 9, 1945, Patton was riding in a staff car outside Mannheim when a U.S. Army truck turned in front of his vehicle. The collision was low speed. Everyone else in both vehicles was uninjured. Patton was thrown forward and suffered a severe cervical spinal injury. He was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, George Smith Patton, Jr. died of pulmonary edema in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. He was 60 years old. The war had been over for 7 months. He is buried in Luxembourg, at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, among the men of his Third Army. He requested it that way. Not at West Point, not in California, not in Washington. With his soldiers, the ones who crossed the rivers with him. Eisenhower never publicly said what he wrote in that private diary on March 26th. He never told Patton that the Rhine crossing would be regarded as one of the most brilliant operations of the war. He maintained the official position that Operation Plunder had been the main effort and Oppenheim a supporting attack until the end of his life. But when he wrote his memoirs, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, he spent more pages on Patton than on Montgomery. The arithmetic of that choice was its own kind of statement. Montgomery received his field marshal's baton, his knighthood, his place in the official history as the architect of the Rhine crossing. He outlived Patton by 27 years, dying in 1976 at age 88. He never once publicly acknowledged that Oppenheim had weakened the defenses he faced at Wesel. But German officers who testified at post-war debriefings were less diplomatic. General Hermann Balck, whose forces faced Patton's advance east of the Rhine, told Allied interrogators that the Oppenheim crossing had made coordinated German defense of the Rhine line impossible. His exact assessment: "We were already reacting to Patton when Montgomery crossed. We had nothing left for Wesel that we hadn't already moved south." The operational lesson embedded in those words outlasted the war by decades. American military doctrine after 1945 absorbed what Patton had demonstrated at Oppenheim not as a deliberate institutional choice, but as an inescapable empirical conclusion. Speed kills, not in the colloquial sense, but in the precise military sense. An enemy that cannot establish a defensive line before contact is an enemy that cannot defend effectively, regardless of its absolute strength. The armored exploitation that Patton drove from Oppenheim to Frankfurt in 7 days became the template for what American military planners called air-land battle doctrine in the 1980s. The strategic framework that emphasized rapid, deep penetration to disrupt enemy rear areas before defensive lines could form. That doctrine was tested in January 1991 in the deserts of Kuwait and Iraq. The 100-hour ground campaign that destroyed Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard in 4 days drew on principles that Patton had demonstrated on German roads in March 1945. Speed, surprise, hit where the enemy is not looking. Do not pause to consolidate when the enemy is reacting rather than defending. Commanders who planned the left hook through the Iraqi desert had studied the Oppenheim crossing specifically in their staff college education. The intellectual lineage runs in a direct line from assault boats on the Rhine to M1 Abrams tanks crossing the Iraqi border at night. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's spearhead at Oppenheim, was redesignated and restructured multiple times in the post-war decades, but its lineage units carried the combat history of that Rhine crossing into Korea, into the Cold War deployments in Germany, and into the institutional memory of American armored doctrine. The crossing that nobody authorized became the crossing that everybody studied. There is one detail about the Oppenheim crossing that most accounts omit. A detail that sits in the operational records of the 5th Infantry Division and that Patton's own after-action report referenced only obliquely, presumably because making it too explicit would have created additional command complications that nobody needed after the fact. The assault boats used in the initial crossing on the night of March 22nd were not technically Third Army's boats. They had been pre-positioned near Oppenheim as part of a logistics staging operation for a future crossing that had not yet been authorized. The engineers who moved those boats to the water on the night of March 22nd were operating on orders that described the movement as a readiness exercise, a training drill. The paperwork classified the boat movement as preparation, not execution, which means that the crossing of the Rhine, the unauthorized act that Eisenhower learned about from Bradley at 0800 the following morning, was technically documented as a training exercise until the moment the first Americans reached the far bank. Patton had not simply crossed without permission. He had constructed the administrative scaffolding to make it look like preparation, right up until it became fact. At which point, the facts were irreplaceable, and the paperwork was irrelevant. When this detail surfaced in declassified Army records decades later, the reaction from military historians was divided, precisely along the lines one would expect. Some called it further evidence of Patton's insubordination and institutional recklessness. Others called it the clearest possible demonstration of what made him irreplaceable. He understood that in war, the moment between preparation and execution is not a bureaucratic distinction. It is the moment where either side can still stop.